You don't belong here, Eric. Just look at yourself. Mrs. Thornton's sharp voice echoed through the silent classroom as 20 pairs of eyes turned toward Eric Miller, the boy in the ragged hoodie sitting near the back. His small, frail hands gripped his notebook tightly, his knuckles turning white as his face burned with shame. The classroom, brightly lit by the morning sun, suddenly felt suffocating. Mrs. Thornton, a woman in her late 50s, with piercing eyes and a permanent frown, stood in front of the room, arms crossed in disapproval. "You think someone like you will ever succeed?" she sneered. "Coming in here with torn shoes and that ridiculous old backpack. You don't even have the right books. How do you expect to pass my class?" A few snickers came from the richer kids sitting near the front. Chase Parker, the son of a wealthy businessman, leaned toward his friends. "Maybe he should just drop out and save himself the embarrassment," he whispered loud enough for the class to hear. More laughter followed. Eric stared down at his desk, willing himself not to cry. He had spent the morning digging through his worn-out bag, hoping to find an extra notebook. But he already knew the truth. His family could barely afford school supplies. "Maybe if you spent less time dreaming and more time working, you wouldn't be such a failure," Mrs. Thornton continued, shaking her head in disgust. "Honestly, it's kids like you who waste everyone's time." Eric swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to disappear, but what nobody knew, not Mrs. Thornton, not Chase, not any of the students, was that Eric's true identity would soon shake the entire school to its core. Before Mrs. Thornton could continue her tirade, a sharp knock on the door silenced the room. Principal Harris, a tall man with neatly combed silver hair and a commanding presence, stepped inside. His deep blue eyes scanned the classroom, but they lingered on Eric for a moment before turning to Mrs. Thornton. "Mrs. Thornton, may I have a word with you?" His voice was calm but firm. The teacher's face twitched with irritation, but she quickly composed herself. "Of course, Principal Harris," she said, plastering on a fake smile. She turned to the students. "Everyone, open your textbooks to page 112. I expect silence while I'm gone." As she followed Principal Harris outside, the door shut behind them, leaving the classroom buzzing with whispers. "Dude, what if the principal saw her yelling at Eric?" one student murmured. "Who cares?" Chase scoffed. "That loser deserves it." Eric remained quiet, his fists clenched under his desk. Out in the hallway, Mrs. Thornton huffed impatiently. "Principal Harris, I'm in the middle of my lesson. What is this about?" The principal folded his arms, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "I just walked by and heard you humiliating a student in front of the entire class." Mrs. Thornton stiffened. "I was merely pointing out the truth. That boy, Eric Miller, is one of our students," Harris interrupted, his voice sharp. "And in this school, we do not belittle students based on their financial situation." She scoffed. "Principal Harris, let's be realistic. Some kids just don't belong. They slow the others down. And frankly, someone like Eric, you have no idea who Eric Miller really is." Mrs. Thornton's eyebrows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Principal Harris sighed and adjusted his tie. "You'll find out soon enough." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Mrs. Thornton standing there, confused, and for the first time, slightly nervous. Back inside the classroom, Eric sat frozen in his chair, his mind racing. What did Principal Harris mean? What was there to know about him? He was just a poor kid trying to get through school. The door swung open, and Mrs. Thornton returned, her face tense. She scanned the classroom, her eyes flicking to Eric, before quickly looking away. "Continue reading," she snapped, trying to regain control. But the students sensed something was off. Even Chase, who usually had something snarky to say, just exchanged curious glances with his friends. Eric wanted to disappear. He hated attention. He had learned long ago that being noticed only led to trouble. Lunch break came, and Eric was just about to leave when a student messenger from the office walked in. "Eric Miller?" the girl called. Eric hesitated. "Yeah?" "Principal Harris wants to see you in his office." A ripple of whispers spread across the room. "Oh man, he's in trouble," someone muttered. Eric swallowed hard. This couldn't be good. Mrs. Thornton smirked slightly but said nothing as Eric gathered his things and slowly walked out. The long hallway to the principal's office felt endless. He tried to think of what he might have done wrong. Was this about Mrs. Thornton? Would he be expelled for making her mad? When he reached the office, Principal Harris was waiting for him at the door. "Come in, Eric," he said warmly. Eric stepped inside and immediately noticed something strange. The office wasn't empty. A well-dressed man in an expensive navy blue suit sat in the guest chair, checking his watch. He looked up as Eric entered, and his face broke into a wide smile. "Eric, finally, we meet." Eric blinked. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" The man chuckled. "Not yet, but you will soon." Principal Harris gestured for Eric to sit. "Eric, it's time you knew the truth about who you really are." Eric's stomach twisted in knots as he cautiously took a seat. His eyes darted between Principal Harris and the mysterious man, who seemed oddly familiar. "Eric," Principal Harris began, his voice calm but firm, "this is Mr. Jonathan Miller." Eric's breath caught in his throat. Miller? That was his last name. "Wait, Miller?" Eric asked, confusion evident in his voice. Jonathan nodded, his smile softening. "Yes, Eric. I'm your grandfather." The room seemed to spin. Grandfather? That couldn't be right. "There must be a mistake," Eric stammered. "I never had a grandfather. My mom always said it was just us." Jonathan sighed, his face clouded with emotion. "Your mother, she had her reasons for keeping you away, but I've been looking for you for years." Eric shook his head, his mind racing. Why now? Why not before? Principal Harris placed a reassuring hand on Eric's shoulder. "Because, Eric, your grandfather's a man of great influence. He wanted to find you at the right time." Eric's heart pounded. What did that even mean? Jonathan leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Eric, I own one of the biggest companies in this city. You're my only grandson, and my rightful heir." Eric's jaw dropped. Heir? To a company? This had to be some kind of joke. Meanwhile, back in the classroom, Mrs. Thornton was relishing her lunch break, chatting with her fellow teachers. "Honestly, some kids just don't belong in this school," she muttered, stirring her coffee. "Like that Eric Miller. Always looking lost, always wearing those ragged clothes. He's going nowhere in life." Another teacher raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Mrs. Thornton scoffed. "Oh, please. I've seen enough kids like him. They drop out or end up in dead-end jobs." Just then, the principal's voice echoed through the school intercom. "Attention, staff and students. I'd like to make a special announcement. It has come to our attention that one of our students, Eric Miller, is not just any student. He is the grandson of Mr. Jonathan Miller, the owner of Miller Enterprises. The teacher's lounge went dead silent. Mrs. Thornton nearly dropped her coffee. "What?" she gasped. Mrs. Thornton's face turned pale as murmurs spread through the teacher's lounge. The other teachers exchanged glances, some looking amused, others outright shocked. "That can't be right," Mrs. Thornton stammered. "Eric? That Eric. The one I—" She stopped mid-sentence, realizing the gravity of what she had done. The principal's voice continued over the intercom. "Mr. Miller has graciously decided to invest in our school, ensuring that no student is ever judged based on their financial situation again. We will be holding a school-wide assembly shortly. Staff, please make your way to the auditorium." Mrs. Thornton swallowed hard. She had publicly humiliated the grandson of a powerful billionaire. Her colleagues' eyes were on her now, some smirking, others waiting to see her reaction. "Wow, Thornton," one teacher said, barely containing her laughter. "Guess you picked the wrong kid to mess with." Mrs. Thornton stood up so fast that her chair scraped against the floor. Without saying a word, she stormed out of the lounge and made her way toward the auditorium. The auditorium buzzed with students whispering among themselves. Eric sat next to Principal Harris on stage, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on him. His heart pounded in his chest. He still hadn't fully processed what was happening. Jonathan Miller stood at the podium, addressing the school. "I built my company from the ground up," he said, his voice calm yet powerful. "I know what it's like to struggle, to feel like the world is against you. And I also know how important it is to have people who believe in you." He paused, glancing at Eric with pride. "My grandson, Eric, has been through more than most, but he never gave up. And today, I want to make something clear. No student in this school should ever be judged for where they come from." The audience erupted into applause. Eric swallowed the lump in his throat. "And as for those who mistreated him," Jonathan continued, his tone sharpening, "I hope they learn a valuable lesson today." Eric followed his grandfather's gaze and found Mrs. Thornton standing in the crowd, her face stiff with humiliation. "Mrs. Thornton," Jonathan said, addressing her directly, "would you like to say something?" The entire auditorium fell silent. Every student and teacher turned to look at her. Mrs. Thornton's hands clenched into fists. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Finally, she took a deep breath and stepped forward. She started, her voice shaky. "I made a mistake." She turned to Eric, swallowing her pride. "Eric, I shouldn't have treated you the way I did. I was wrong." Eric stared at her, unsure how to feel. Jonathan leaned toward him and whispered, "The choice is yours, son. You can forgive her or let her sit in her shame." Eric took a deep breath. Eric's heart pounded as he looked at Mrs. Thornton. The same woman who had humiliated him in front of his classmates, made him feel worthless, and treated him like he didn't belong, now stood before him, humbled and ashamed. He had two choices. He could let her stew in her humiliation or take the high road. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. "I appreciate your apology, Mrs. Thornton," he said, his voice steady but firm. "But an apology doesn't erase the way you made me feel." The students gasped. Some even started murmuring. No one had ever spoken to Mrs. Thornton like that. "But," Eric continued, his gaze unwavering, "I believe in second chances. I don't want anyone else to feel the way I did. So instead of just apologizing to me, I hope you'll take this experience and treat every student with respect, no matter what they wear, where they come from, or how much money they have." A tense silence followed. Then applause erupted across the auditorium. Students cheered. Teachers nodded approvingly. Even Principal Harris smiled. Mrs. Thornton lowered her head. I will, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jonathan Miller placed a proud hand on Eric's shoulder. That, he said loud enough for everyone to hear, is the mark of a true leader. After the assembly, students approached Eric, shaking his hand, patting him on the back, and even apologizing for standing by while he was mistreated. For the first time, he felt truly seen, not as the poor kid, but as someone who had earned respect. Mrs. Thornton, meanwhile, kept her distance. Though she had apologized, she knew words alone wouldn't fix things. She had a lot of work to do. A week later, she surprised her class with a new initiative: character over status. She encouraged students to share their struggles and help one another, proving that she had taken Eric's lesson to heart. As for Eric, his life changed forever. His grandfather ensured he never had to worry about finances again, but more importantly, he had found his voice. The experience had shaped him into someone who stood up for himself and others. And Mrs. Thornton? She learned a lesson she'd never forget. Respect isn't about money. It's about character.